linked in collaborative notes. There's a diagram of the current landscape analysis and its state. And then there are some spreadsheet tabs with information that was consolidated from the landscape analysis until now that we plan to use as the basis for an in-depth community consultation and analysis. All right, so I'm almost done, after which I'll hand over to Alison Lawless, that is online. And she'll briefly take us through the comments that we received and on the case statement, together with our work program and small amendments that we made as a result. And then I'll also give feedback about the surveys and inputs we received at the previous plenary in terms of the scope of work, the program, and the content that we are going to work on. And then the important one, point 4, but given our low turnout, that could be a very informal consultation in 3 groups, the online group together, then maybe myself together with Olivier and Kyle and anybody else that shows up in breakout group 2, and then the rest of us here in breakout group 3. To discuss some specific topics that we'll highlight shortly. And then there's time for an open discussion, for feedback from the breakouts, and planning our next steps. So I'll advance the slides for you, Alison, but you're welcome to start talking about the case statement and the work program.
Thanks very much, I appreciate it. Will you go to the next slide, please, and we'll start there. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. I'm going to give you a little bit of background into this working group and what the plan is for the work and the outputs that we have. We start with a discussion around supply and demand. There are lots of repositories out there. This pyramid is letting you know how many there are and how many of that set are either registered or certified. So at an estimate, there's just thousands of repositories, and of those repositories, there are a few thousand that are registered with various registry services, such as re3data, DataCite, or Fair Sharing. And then even more refined are the number that are actually certified by things such as Core Trust Seal or using the ISO specification. That's somewhere around, but not exceeding 200. So we have an issue here where we have many repositories, but very few of them are actually taking up the certification that is available, and it is of very high quality. Can we go ahead and go to the next slide, please? So what I will show you here is a little bit about the various ways that data gets curated and passed through from the depositors of the data through to the repositories themselves. There are a variety of ways repositories can store data. If you look to the left, you have uncurated data. You might have a data set that comes straight from an experiment and then is stored in a repository. Very little extra work is applied to it. It's a type of preservation and archiving. You can also have data which is self-curated by those who create it. After which you can either apply additional levels of curation, a more formal curation that might be part of a submission process to a repository, or perhaps crowdsourced curation if you're working in a resource that is a community or a crowdsourced type of data. Once you move from curated to uncurated data, then you are thinking about submitting it to repositories, domain-specific repositories, even generalist repositories that have the extra level of curation. As well as the data being curated, you might well decide to put it in a repository that's either certified or not certified. And additionally to that, you have services on top of that. So some elements of the service that are provided by repositories, it can be often preservation or preservation of the data, long-term archiving, can be outsourced. And there are lots of benefits. And in our case statement, we talk about economy of scale. And repositories who are certifying according to currently existing procedures, if they make use of such services, there's quite a large burden on them for describing those services. They have to be certified individually for each application rather than the service as a whole. So what we want to do is we're going to focus on this bottom right section. Go ahead with the next slide, please, Vim, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about that. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about the primary the primary issues. Yeah, I hid the slide before after that because I didn't want to go into. Ooh. I'll just pause for a second.
Sorry about that. The automated advance doesn't seem to work anymore.
It's frustrating. There we are. Oh, back one. Can you go back one? If not, that's okay. I don't want to make it too hard. There we are. So before I talk to you about that bottom right area, I just thought it might be useful, and Vim provided this lovely slide that talks about the issues that people have identified around certification and which ones are most important to them. And rather than going through the particular numbers, all I want you to really take away here is the main issues that people have with trying to get their repository certified. At the top, you have the cost and time required for certification. Certification tends to be a binary process. You have to work hard to move through many steps to get a certification. And at the end, you're either certified or not. It's hard for people to see if you are partially along the route. And also, it doesn't cover everything. And if you look further down the line, you see generalist repositories cannot be certified. Services, supporting services, those that are preservation related, as I mentioned before, they also cannot be certified. There's also a lack of awareness of how to certify or which services can be used to certify. And you cannot partially certify. You are either certified or not. So we are trying through this working group to address a lot of these issues and to enhance the types of certification that are available out there to increase the umbrella of trust, I think is the expression used on one of the slides. Could you go to the next slide, please? So this is the image of 2 slides ago, and we've highlighted the bottom right here. But because as a working group, we're going to focus on those ones marked A, B, and C. But we did want to just give you an idea overall of those issues that we covered in the previous slide and the bottlenecks facing people in certification. So in terms of what's focused for this work group, if you look at the area marked A, it's around the actual certification process, going from a non-certified to a certified repository. And these issues that we'll be focusing on are around the complexity and cost of the certification and how there are many requirements to achieve that certification. And ultimately, there's also going to be a question of capacity around how many resources can even be certified annually, you might say. Then there's section B, which is around the scope of certification, where we're talking about the different types of outputs that people have. Certification at the moment mainly focuses around data objects, but there's lots of other types of objects out there, software and other types of digital objects that are associated with research. We're also talking about, again, the granularity of certification. How can we have a more modular approach? And generally features and performances of the certification process. And the final one marked on section C is the inclusion of those service providers, the ones that are providing the extra element of service. It would be ideal to be able to have those service providers also self-certify. The other sections about how quickly data can be curated, about the mechanisms of curation, and about what to do with uncurated flows is out of scope for the working group. Next slide, please. So in terms of our intentions and our outcomes, some of this will sound familiar because I've started covering it already in previous slides, but we want to have a set of modular characteristics that allow, that both reflect the needs of the community and allow repositories to certify in a more modular fashion. We also want to determine which of these features can be delegated to service providers, and also ultimately how those sort of service providers can also be certified. And then we also are going to be talking about the ways that we can achieve that certification, these alternatives to the formal certification processes that already exist and are very high quality. We want to increase the number and the scale of successful certifications with this working group and its outputs. We want to extend the scope of certification beyond data repositories, at least in the sense of getting the ball rolling on these other types of digital research objects. And we also want to allow the community, therefore, to make better informed decisions, because they'll have more information when repositories are able and service providers are able to self-certify and show how far along the journey they are. Next slide, please. This is a very high-level overview of exactly how we might go about doing the appraisals of this. So if you look at the top, we've got a set of desirable features and characteristics that we're looking to do. These inform best practice and recommendations, and ultimately may result in additional standards and specifications, which come together to create community benchmarks. So an individual community can decide what the appropriate set of these modular features are that work for them. And then using these benchmarks, you can perform self-assessment, or you can use the community benchmarks to add an extra layer of the self-assessment. And you could even have a further step where you have reviewers or auditors assessing the assessments. That's a bit circular, apologies, assessing the assessments. Next slide, please. So looking back at this model that we had a few slides ago, we can look at it in the context of the sort of value that we bring. We're going to be talking about certification of services, decentralized certification features, improved numbers of certifications, and appropriate criteria that can be moved across to other types of digital research objects, such as software, non-data repositories, to help their move towards this kind of certification scheme. And of course, although our numbers are small today, our main priority is community consensus for the creation of the features, for evaluation of the features, and of course, ultimately, community consensus around choosing repositories, because that's what it's all about in the end. Next slide, please. I'm reached most of my time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I do want to point out that we are moving slowly. Well, I say slowly, this is early stages still for the working group, and we've already moved through the initial community consultation and worked to create, primarily the other co-chairs and the other members of the group rather than me, to create this initial set of work that you're going to be looking at today. And they've compiled a whole set of interesting content and features to start us off. And what we've done is we've taken a number of different existing certification schemes, as well as different RDA outputs, such as the Data Repository Attribute Working Group output, and created an initial thing for the community to review. And if we go on to the next slide, because that has a slightly different view of this, it gives a timeline. This is the updated work plan for the working group. You'll note that the last plenary was just when the working group was being conceived and then endorsed. And now at this plenary, we're here for the second community consultation. And we're going to slowly move, well, at a steady pace, move over the next 18 months through all of these goals to the creation of a set of outputs that will hopefully allow repositories and service providers to have modular certification. I think more detail on the exact different types of the boxes here will be coming later, but we've just about reached my time, so I will stop there, and I believe that's the last slide anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. So any questions online or in the audience? We've got time for one or two quick clarifications if needed. Yeah.
Do I need to say it again? Okay. What the heck is a technical repository? Okay.
Yeah, I should say that nobody's hearing
So
Vince's
this is
amazing reply.
hosted repository services then.
The people online aren't hearing your reply, Vim. Sorry.
Sorry about that. I forgot about the, no, so just to repeat, so Court Rasil started coining this term after community consultation. And effectively it means somebody that provides technical services to repositories. So for argument's sake, providing long-term preservation service, bit level preservation, format preservation, but nothing else. They are seen as this sort of technical service providers. We can imagine that there will be many more in the future, providing services such as fair assessment as an example, and the like, or assessing licenses that are appropriate for the content. AI is in all probability going to result in an explosion of these kinds of services. So I think the time is right to include them somehow into the certification and appraisal processes. Okay. All right, so very quick feedback then from our previous engagement at Plenary 22. I'm just going to highlight some of the interesting ones there. All of the feedback is in the presentation, so you can have a look at it on your own later on. So there's feedback about, well, information about where the participants come from and what their roles are. And of course, two things to worry about there. The one is the geographic representation in the working group. And the other one is the fact that we have very few representatives from these service providers because they're not, as they said yesterday, RDA is not their tribe. This is not where they come for discussion and new ideas most of the time. So we'll have to work on that. There's some information about what a repository is, because of course, being researchers, most of us, this is the first place where we start. So what is a repository and a service? So we'll get to work on that. We spoke about the relative importance of the issues identified, and I've highlighted the ones again here that that came up trumps, as it were, in the previous consultation. The scope of work, we also had some inputs in terms of the focus, but as I explained, we intend to do the landscape phase fairly widely and then narrow down to what technical repository service providers should worry about and how they will be assessed in later phases of the working groups program. It's interesting that for the compilation of an inventory of the characteristics that we should include, together with prioritization of those characteristics, in both those cases, there was a very heavy emphasis from the participants on involving the community and not only doing desk-based analysis. So that's going to be challenging looking at the turnout today, but we'll have to start figuring how to involve many more people in either online workshops or surveys or a combination of them. And that's something to maybe discuss a little bit later. Then I think the last one also highlighted the fact that foremost in the respondents' minds were this concept of self-assessment as a feasible and desirable future part of the landscape, combined with proper benchmarking. And that sort of makes sense because the only missing part, of course, is that it's not audited or reviewed. But if it's done in a predictable way with a test that is benchmarked against community expectations in terms of its result, there's not too much that can go wrong if that evidence is public, because people can verify it for themselves if they wish to do so. So that's maybe an important part of our work going forward. Okay, I think that's the ones that I wanted to highlight. There are some other feedback elements, of course, that are interesting, but we've incorporated that into the landscape work already, largely into amendments in the case statement and the work plan. So I think all the inputs that we received are accommodated in one way or another in our program going forward. Okay, then I'm quickly going to show you some background on the work that has started. Fortunately, to some extent, I'm able to make progress with this in a funded project in Fair Impact that's also looking at characteristics and features of repositories. So there is at least some funded resources to take the process forward. So a lot of what you will be seeing today is based on work that happened and was funded through Fair Impact until now. One of the important things to consider for us is that in the scope of characteristics of repositories that we've seen up till now, there are normative characteristics. Those are things that will be assessed by some kind of certification, whether it's self-certification or through a review committee. And then there are informative criteria or characteristics that are used by the community to select the repositories that they are going to use that may or may have nothing to do with their current status of certification or the scope of that certification. And the example I use all the time is that Zenodo has seen enormous growth despite not being a certified repository, simply because it's easy to use and it's very quick to get a DOI for your data set. And that's what end users want. So we have to start figuring how to accommodate the end user's perspective and their needs and wants into this whole process of certification and its sort of broader constellation in one way or another. Okay, fortunately for us, when it comes to the normative assessments, work that's being done in FAIR Core for EOSC is sort of standardizing the way in which we define criteria, metrics, and benchmarks and tests. So we can apply that knowledge to some extent also in the working group. And then selection-wise, when people, as I said, try to determine where they should deposit their research outputs, they are going to select an appropriate repository or service, bearing in mind that they can mix and match normative and informative criteria as they see fit. I mean, that's their decision to make, and that they can define their own metrics and tests and benchmarks, either in a community or an institution or a network or a research infrastructure. So we have to anticipate all this complexity in the assessment and appraisal landscape. Be that as it may, we've worked on a number of resources to date. One is that there is a landscape analysis where we define the scope of the things that we take into account, and I'll show you a little bit more about what that entails just now. Then we also have an inventory of all the characteristics and features and criteria that we have identified from these sources in the landscape analysis. So typically, if you look at the color coding there, those are inputs into the landscape assessment that has already been processed either partly or in full. And the list at the moment includes the trust principles, core trust seal, the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, the digital repository attributes working group output from RDA, criteria that matter, which was published some years ago, and then also the care principles. So those color codes are duplicated, as you'll see later on, within the inventory of the characteristics and features that we have identified. The pink ones there at the highest level, of course, come directly from the trust principles, but to those we've added an element that's not in the trust principles, and that is cost, because that's important to end users, but of course it's not something that's evaluated at the current point in time. Okay, and then we have also started categorizing and collecting things that are expected as evidence for certification, grouping them together. There are things like plans and information about products and services. There are things like policies and so on. And so we started categorizing them. And of course, they map to certain criteria, for instance, in Port Seal. So even just that type of work is also interesting and useful because it provides the scope of evidence that people will need to compile or have available either for self-assessment or for formal assessments. And then the other piece of the puzzle that we're working on as we encounter them is that the characteristics and the features and the criteria have to do largely with why we are doing something and what we will be doing to satisfy that criterion or objective. But we also encounter in many of these landscape documents things that focus on the how. So we're taking them out of the list and putting them in a separate collection to say, these are the ways in which you can recover cost, and these are the ways in which you can do this, that, and the other, because clearly it's a different type of class. Okay, so just briefly then, let's see if this will work. If I can find a way to click on a link, that will be helpful. So very quickly, we have this massive collection here of all the different characteristics. Those color codings have to do with their origin. So we try and classify them together if they go together. So there's stuff to do with sustainability, with responsibility, with transparency, user focus, the technology, and the cost. Okay, so that's the first part. So those are all the characteristics and the features that we've identified, grouped together and classified. You'll notice these little notebook icons if you're going to have a look at it. What that is a reference. Many of them are annotations. So if you click on that link, for instance, it should take you to that document, which it doesn't. First rule of demos is never click anywhere. Let's try another one. No, that doesn't work either. Anyway, so those are annotations and reference links so that whatever evidence exists for what we're saying can easily be found and cross-correlated later on. You will also see then that in some corner here, hidden away are all the principles. So for argument's sake, if you look at criteria that matter, there are repository level criteria and dataset level criteria that we have annotated and referenced and linked back into wherever they fit into the bigger scheme of things. So if we go and start and expand some of these views here in terms of responsibility, those dotted lines are mappings from the sources of criteria and desirable characteristics to the classification of those that we have made. So we have this mapping from things like trust and CTS and criteria that matter and whatever into our sets of desirable characteristics. This graph is getting complicated, so I'm open to suggestions on where to move it to so that multiple participants can work on it, and also so that we potentially have a way of representing an even more complex arrangement than we have at the moment. So let's stop with it there and go back to our presentation. So what I thought of doing in the breakout sessions is that we need to try and check on three things. The one is whether the scope of inputs that we are considering in our landscape analysis is adequate, or whether we are missing any important inputs in terms of desirable characteristics and features. So that's the one objective. And I was thinking that the online participants can potentially look at that because it's not going to take an enormous amount of time to do so. And then if you happen to finish in time, then you're welcome to take a coffee break or a dinner break or a breakfast break, depending on where you are in the world, and join us again on the half hour for the last session. Our time here will be 1:30 at that time, at the end of the breakout session. So I'm not anticipating that that this discussion online will take a lot of time, maybe 10 minutes, and then you've got free time until we convene again. Then group two, probably Kyle, myself, and Olivier on that side, to look at whether we're missing any obvious features or characteristics in that. And more importantly, at the moment, it's organized roughly along the trust principles as the main categorizations, but there's no reason to think that that is appropriate. So we might also come up with different organizations of those characteristics. So those we need to discuss, and then also focus maybe more of our time on the kinds of things that we have to evaluate for service providers, because when it comes to the repositories themselves, then the landscape is fairly well defined. But for the service providers, that's not the case. So we have to focus more effort there. And then group three, Moan, I think, will take charge of that over here, together with Dawe. Sorry, we haven't met, so I don't know your, okay. And Ryan, welcome to discuss group three, which I'll show you just now what it boils down to. Okay, so group one, if you look at the slide deck, that's the current scope of stuff that we are evaluating. There's also a table with that list in it in a spreadsheet that you can look at. And if you identify any things that we should add to that, then you can either just write them down or put them into the spreadsheet if you wish to do so. Group two, I'll work through with my colleagues over there. And then group three, to look at these three aspects. The one is whether there are any other options that we should be looking at in terms of type of assessment, because we've identified self-assessment with evidence and benchmarks, or just plain self-assessment. And then when we assign characteristics to those, whether it applies or not, or maybe, or in part, so that think about whether that list is adequate. The same for research outputs. Maybe we want to add to it and change the kinds of selections that people can make when they fill in the sheet. And then also the applicability, which stakeholders those characteristics might apply to, whether we should modify that list at all. And then technical repository service providers can be linked to characteristics or features, of course. And again, the list there to determine whether we should allow another option that we're not currently missing. So the big objective here is to take maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes max, 20 minutes maximum to quickly discuss this, and because this will form the basis of a large community consultation. So this is our opportunity to think about it and to make sure that it sort of is as good as it can be by the time we engage with the community. Any questions from yourselves or online, Ryan? Okay, so we can kick off then. Yeah, and then, as I say, by in 20 minutes or so, come back with feedback. Thanks. Okay, cool, thanks.
Hello. Yeah. Hello. Good. So that's great. Back on later. Hello, everybody online. So I think we're officially part of group breakout one. As Vim was saying, I think, seeing as people are joining from their own destinations of work, it's up to us really and up to you. I'm in the room here in Costa Rica, but it's up to you if you want to maybe ask any questions or maybe you want to discuss the breakout or that landscape table. I've seen some people have added a few new entries there already, which is great. If you prefer to work off sort of silently, that's perfectly okay. But if you want to bring the discussion or kind of open up the discussion or speak in any capacity, that's also great. So as I said, I'll be here as to kind of facilitate that chat if we want to have it. But as Vim said, free to kind of work silently and I can relay the discussion or the new additions to that sheet to the room later. Hi, Gilles.
Hi, Ryan. I've had a look at the table. It's I have to switch between browser and Zoom, but anyways, I'm impressed by the list. I must admit there are a number of entries of which I was not aware,
Okay,
and it seems difficult to me already to take care of such an enormous amount of input that's been published.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not even sure exactly how to do that. Do you have intentions already on how to handle this enormous amount of input?
I think it will be a case of maybe looking at them like looking at each of those sources individually. I mean, not all of these things here. I'm just looking at the entries that are in blue that were added previously. Not all of these, maybe Vim might contradict me, but not all of these will be completely relevant to the group. So I think we will be focusing on ones where which have these characteristics that we think were going to be more relevant to the other parts of the groups that the other breakouts are focusing on. So yeah, I agree with you. It is quite a large task, and as I think that would typically this would be too large an undertaking for an RDA working group. But as Vim was saying, because he is able to fund part of the work he's spending, and some colleagues of his are spending on this project via this fair impact project, I think we'll be able to do a bit more detailed analysis on it.
Okay, and so what we are supposed to bring an answer about, is there a source of information that's missing in this list? Now, the objective is to work on service providers or a way to make services more modular that could be external to repositories. And I'm not sure if I can myself think of any of these sources directly relevant to such an objective. I mean, except as has been mentioned already, except for long-term archival or sometimes simple preservation, I've not come across in the past external services. So that's why I'm a bit, I'm not skeptical, but interrogative about what we can actually extract from these sources to be specific about external services. Is there something I misunderstood here?
No, I think that's a fair point. I sorry, I'm just trying to find my screen again. No, I definitely think that's a fair point in terms of it being difficult to make the connection between these sort of platforms and sources of information for repositories and maybe make the step to service providers from here. I think what we're looking at particularly with this breakout is just those sources of information about repositories. I think the next step will be to look at the service providers. And so it is a kind of a separate track of work for this group.
Okay.
So there's a lot of noise in the room here, so let's mute my microphone. I think that the point you're making though is definitely valid. And I think if possible, if you could bring it up with when we sort of finish the breakout rooms in like 10 minutes and maybe put that question to the rest of the group and to the co-chairs specifically, to Mohan and Vim.
Okay. I'll do that. Just browsing the list to see if in the titles there is anything that, any hint on something devoted to services in terms of external services. But these titles are a bit too general to really have an idea about that.
That's okay.
Ryan,
Yeah, go ahead.
I have put a comment in the breakout session notes.
I saw that.
Okay, so I wondered whether that was expected to be done or whether it's notes by the co-chairs only.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't hear all of the questions or all of the question.
Oh, sorry, it was meant to for Ryan,
Oh, okay.
internal to group one. Sorry.
Okay. So I take it that the online group's comments are then in the document, online notes. Yeah, thanks very much for that. And then in group 2, we had some additions to the cost and the technology elements and some decisions to take some of the little nodes in there and make them into how instead of what and why, because things like how you recover cost shouldn't be part of the criteria, but it is potentially of interest to the end user, of course, when they look at using a particular service. So that's certainly informative and not normative, and potentially classified as the hows. So Moan, any specific feedback? You say you got through 2 of them? Yeah.
Yeah, we had a lively discussion on the 2 assessment type and research output, and we didn't have time to get to the applicability box. First and foremost, there was quite a bit of confusion or clarity needed on exactly the definition or what is meant by not the 3 categories: certified repository, self-assessment with evidence, or self-assessment, but on the green, beige, red and blue, what exactly is meant by that. So there needs to be some definition provided. There was also a sentiment that a lot of, particularly, smaller, medium-sized repositories will opt for self-assessment with evidence or self-assessment because they don't have the resources to go through formal certification. Anything else you want to add on that particular? on the top one.
I think this is not discussed, but I was just thinking the categories like certified and self-assessment, like two category, right? I wonder if there is maybe another one is a peer-reviewed. So it's not necessarily peer-reviewed to certify, but can be peer-reviewed just review, like something like that.
Somebody else is actually like an advisory peer review consortia that says, so it doesn't go through a $10,000 certification process. The other thing that was brought up was that if you have medical or health information, none of this may be actually formally applicable because you cannot advertise, mention that because of, in the US, we have what is called HIPAA, which is you are not allowed to share information surrounding the type of data, and therefore it may not be applicable for, I don't know how you go about thinking, for sensitive data certification or assessment, but that was also mentioned as a type of repository that has to be dealt with somewhat differently than open science, open data type repository. Please.
I think so. I know like the one major repository I know that has sensitive data that has gone through that thing is ICPSR at Michigan. And I think they did TDR or the TDR track. But yeah, maybe there's a need for like a special, like a sensitive data type of assessment, right?
The repository she is referring to, they collect social science data. And in the US, we have personally identified information that cannot be shared. So you can't attach a phone number or address to an individual's name. All of that has to be behind protected, layers. So that's social science data, not just medical data, is also another category where you cannot publicly share date of birth, other information like your social security information and things like that.
So just to clarify, this inability to share the data, does that extend to the characteristics of the repository? Because that's what we're interested in here, and not the data that that repository is responsible for. So does HIPAA also prevent you from sharing characteristics of the repository? I don't think so. So I think it may be true that you can't share data, but the metadata of the repository, as it were, the kind of things that you would put in read data or share with Cortra Seal, I don't think that would be an issue ever. Maybe the number of data sets or stuff like that gets to a gray area, but generally I think these characteristics are probably common knowledge and publicly available.
Just to loop back to the first breakout, because I know Gilles has left a comment just on what we were discussing there, but I wanted to put a question to you, Wim, that Gilles posed. So we added a few things to the list. So take out my headphone because I can hear myself twice. So we added a few things to that tab. There was some contribution. I added a few things. There was contributions from others. But the question Gilles had said that the list appears to be fairly comprehensive about repositories. Is there anything about services, or is it implicit that any repository feature could become an external service?
I think the latter statement is true. So any of the kind of things that a repository does at the moment can potentially become an outsourced service. But it's also true that the whole field of the service providers is not sort of well documented or researched. So we're going to struggle to find formal sets of criteria or publications about them, in my view. So we'll have to put our minds in later phases to trying to structure this and come up with a good definitive set of what criteria are applicable to service providers, almost as new research in a way.
The ambiguity of words like partly and maybe, because how do you interpret those two was another comment that was made in our discussion.
Yeah, so I agree that we need to make a glossary of what these things mean, of course. Partly is something that says, yes, this is an element, but there's more to it. There's maybe 3 categories underlying it, and some of them are applicable and some of them are not. Whereas maybe says, I don't really know, it could be applicable. But you're right, we have to make a little glossary prior to engaging wider to say, this is what these categories mean in our survey information.
Second one too, the research output, and those 4 are good, but there were 1 or 2 more that were mentioned that perhaps should be in that row. Was that to you who brought up that?
I think is probably because we don't understand the goal, of this. We didn't see the previous work. So the anticipation is that maybe this will be used to filter a list of things, right? And then that'll make sense. Is that mandatory or optional? But maybe I think the informative and no is need a little bit more definition. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So as I said, maybe a bit too quickly, we should describe it, of course, but if it's mandatory or optional, it will form part of some kind of assessment. So there will be a benchmark attached to it, and you will either fail or pass or have a score or whatever the outcome is. But if it's informative, it's not going to be assessed, but it is the basis of selection by an end user potentially, right? So do you support this metadata standard? Yes or no, right? So people might select the service on that basis, even though you're never going to evaluate the service on that basis. But we'll explain that a little bit in more detail. And then just to be clear, this part about the research outputs, that's a nice to have for the working group. So I thought that while we're asking people for input and sort of coaching them and getting them to respond to us, if there's time, they can apply their minds about whether these criteria or characteristics apply to other research outputs. But the working group will not publish recommendations about that or anything like it. It's a sort of a supplementary input to future working groups that might be looking at it in much more detail, because we're only going to focus ultimately on the criteria and characteristics and informative features that are applicable to the technical repository service providers. That's what the working group has to recommend about at the end. Yes, that's right. So the rest will be sort of nice to have aspects. Okay, thanks very much. We have about 6 minutes or so for general observations and questions and clarifications, or new ideas that you've come up with in the meantime. So let's look maybe at comments. Yeah, okay. So.
Maybe just like a comment. I think I'm really impressed with the mapping you already did for trust principles. I think maybe that can be maybe work with the trust principle adoption working group. I think that would be a great use case for that.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that's a good collaboration over the next several months. So that working group, what's its lifetime, remaining lifetime? Ah, okay. Okay, but there's a good overlap then between the two working groups time periods. So yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay, other comments? Anything online? Yeah, go ahead.
A question, and this might be because I'm not totally certain how this will work, but so when I think of like service providers and you mentioned the term outsourcing, right? And so I hear that and I think private company. What makes you think that private companies are going to be transparent enough to go through or even willing to go through this kind of or even right share enough of their information in order to make an informed decision beyond like whatever marketing crap they put out, right? I don't know if you have an answer to that.
Yeah, I think there's a fairly powerful incentive, and we have opportunity starting in January, of course, to test that premise in the EOSC Eden project, which will involve EOSC Eden project, which will involve service providers and repositories, and will be looking in much more detail at these characteristics. So the working group's effort is also an input to that project, and we'll get feedback from them. But to answer your question more directly, at the moment, let's say there's a long-term preservation service such as Archivum. Every time a repository wants to certify itself and making use of that service, they have to go through all the aspects of long-term preservation again and be recertified individually every time. So it's in the repository's interest and in the service provider's interest to be certified once for a period of 3 years, for instance, and then any repository that uses their service is automatically passing on the aspects that are provided by that service provider, and they don't have to go through the trouble of recertifying. So I think that's the most compelling motivation.
Yeah, but I wonder if the question also has some nuances that I understood that, for example, like if I'm offering a repository service, but I have some vendors that I use, and I'm doing the assessment for my service, I should be taking on the accountability of how the vendors are managing the data, for example, that the user doesn't have that interface between my vendor that I'm using and themselves. So I think it's a responsibility of the service provider to then take ownership of this.
Data repositories on certain services. But you're right, the repository will take responsibility, but they will work with the vendor to make sure that they are providing certain services.
There's a very nice analogy for that. If you submit a tax return, it's your responsibility. But if you're using an advisor, that advisor in most jurisdictions has to have some kind of certification. So you don't have to go to the trouble of proving that certification, but it's your responsibility to hand in the tax return that he or she is assisting you with. So that's a sort of analogy. So Kyle is right. The responsibility is still with a primary repository, in this case, seeking certification, but they don't have to resupply the information if they are making use of. So it's their responsibility to make sure that they continue using certified service providers. And if the certification is going to lapse, to potentially do it differently, because that's also going to happen. The service provider will be certified, but not recertified. So after 3 years, you cannot make use of that certification anymore. So there are nuances, I think, but we've got a bit of time over the next 17 months to think about it. Okay, so in the last 10 minutes, I maybe just want to give a preview of what happens next. So starting on 11 December at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 p.m. UTC, which in the US will be early morning, and in the East will be fairly inconvenient, late evening, I would say. But that's sort of what we got from our inquiries to the working group prospective members as the most suitable time. And Ryan, I think that initially we said we're going to try and get together every 2 weeks, or is it monthly at the moment? Okay, I think 2 weeks is a bit tough, so every month we'll touch base. In the first meeting, we will share more about the structure of the meetings, the standard items that we'll be looking at, and our ways of working. I happen to make a lot of use of annotation software, for instance, but there are simpler and more difficult ways to do it, so we can discuss those aspects as well. And then Max Wilkinson, who was one of our co-chairs, had to step out because he's no longer working at ARDC. So we potentially also have an opening for an additional co-chair. I'm not sure whether we will accept more than that, but I don't think there's anything from preventing us from taking on additional co-chairs if there's an interest from people in the community. So if anyone here or in the online participants, any of you are interested in contributing more directly, then also let Ryan know. I think that will be the simplest. And then we can also discuss that at the first formal meeting of the working group. Okay, and then to the end of January, I can at least continue with the inventory of desirable characteristics, but I'm really keen to involve others if you have some interest or spare capacity. So let Ryan know or let me know, because the more we can split the task, of course, the quicker we can do it, and potentially, have a better review process if we can look at one another's work. So if anyone is interested in working on that task one, then please let me know, because our main objective must be to get to at least a draft list of this inventory of characteristics towards the end of January or thereabouts, that is broadly accepted by our working group. There may be changes or improvements in the future, but we need to get a starting point, as it were, because we need this to start getting community input. And that community input is a subject for thinking about and to talk about at our next working group meeting, because it's not clear to me, to be honest, what the most effective way would be to get broad-based input. I know that for Fair's Fair, there was a survey sent to repositories in the EU. How that was arranged, I can find out, but that, of course, has got a very narrow geographic focus from one perspective. The other option is to approach certified members of Core Trust Seal or of the World Data System. But that's also a skewed view of the world because they are by definition all certified, and they may not see any reason to change, or few of them might see any reason to change. So think about this. As I always say, you have lots of time in the shower. So put that on your shower list and think about what the ways could be in which we can sort of turbocharge our community engagement one way or another. And we already have, without the benefit of a shower.
I think I added them somewhere in one of these documents, but the Digital Library Federation, it's a bunch of more, let me pick a sentence. It is a member organization and it is fairly expensive, so it is also kind of skewed, but it is a lot of like larger and medium American and Canadian institutions. And we're really involved repository community. And so I think that would be a really good step.
I mean, that way you know about this. We did circulate that survey for the Trust Principles Outreach Adoption Group already. So there is, we obviously can't share that list, that contacts list, but we have done that with Tiger, and we can do it again. Really, essentially recompile that list. And there are obviously other ways we're going to help out with the outreach and that.
Okay, that will also be useful, but of course one has this reticence to leverage lists that are compiled by membership organizations or registries like Read Data because they probably actively discourage it. So it's complicated to get the contact list sorted out in a non-intrusive way, if one can put it that way. Okay, and then the other thing to think about is how do we structure this engagement with the community, because sending them a spreadsheet with little boxes that they've got to tick and choose out of a menu, I can say from now on, is not going to work. It's too difficult and cumbersome and long-winded. So we need to find a way to either subset the inquiry and send only part of it to some members in the community, which is not ideal, but probably necessary. That's one option. The other one is to structure it very differently, more like a question and answer type thing, like you would get in Slido or similar. But let's say collecting a lot of information on each slide with a number of clicks. But have a very focused question, maybe dealing with one of the subtopics of certification, and ask people just to click in a matrix, because that might go a lot quicker and easier for the respondents. So I'm inviting ideas and thoughts about how to structure this community engagement, whether it's a workshop. That might be a good idea if it's a very lengthy engagement survey, because then the challenge is to get people to the workshop, but once they're there, we can guide them through the process. So that becomes less difficult for them to do. So I think those are the big things to think about and to sort out in the short term. Okay, and then those tasks I was thinking of once we have reasonable subscription to the working group, to also start splitting the work amongst ourselves into task groups. But we can discuss that at our first meeting to see if there's any possibility of having subgroups focusing on a specific aspect, and then to get back to the main meeting every month. Okay, so that's it for us. We are giving you back 1 minute of your life, which I think is fantastic. So thanks very much for your attention and enthusiastic participation. And we didn't have a big turnout, but we had some good input. So thank you to the people online, and see you next time. Thank you.